philosophy about the
You just got us. Well, I heard Mark ask me.
It was a lot of work.
I can't navigate it.
Well, it would.
I keep backtracking.
Well, I just, that, I read that.
Maybe here. Yeah, now I can.
He was, he was. During World War I.
You wanted to go to Abby? Yeah, maybe. Top share.
There's all of them.
He was really good.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm very interested. So I have none of those talents.
Yes, now we're good.
No, I have none of those talents.
I'm assuming everyone online.
Yeah, I mean, it should if you're sharing.
All right, shall we take our seats?
It's hilarious.
I'm sorry.
Administrative wise. Interesting cat hair.
Next time, ask for.
I should have.
How are you today? Did you get people? No, that has to be Brenda.
She said, I know. All right, folks, we'll begin session 2, drug guidelines and review quantities, consistency, proportionality, and individualized justice. Scott?
John, I'm going to turn it over to you. We've got a distinguished panel today to kind of talk about this. One of the things that I wanted to kind of go over, and John's going to kind of give us a snapshot of what we're looking at for drug guidelines, where most of these are following on the grid, so that we can kind of have a baseline of going forward to talk from. Then Professor Mark Osler will be talking with us a little bit about some of the things that he has done in his research. And then we're happy to have Tony Mativi and Mickey here from the KBI to talk a little bit more perspective from their end as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to John for the drug guideline discussion.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here. Workshop day is kind of my favorite day of the work year. It allows me to kind of nerd out into data and policy, but it really is kind of that one day where we're devoted to being able to shape policy and legislation for the coming year and maybe actually put our fingerprint on the criminal justice system in Kansas. So I think this is going to be a very good discussion on the drug guideline, and we're going to kind of focus specifically on drug weights and then also on departures. So everyone has a copy, who's in person has a copy in front of them of the drug grid. So if you're struggling to see the screen, you should have a drug grid in front of you. As you can see, drug grid only has one severity levels 1 through 5, 1 being the most severe, 5 obviously being possession. And then on the bottom, you can see the drug weights and the specific drug amounts for each severity level. So as you can see, there's fentanyl, meth, and heroin on that first column, they are all grouped together, so it doesn't matter how much weight you have of that substance. They all basically are charged as the same weight regardless of the substance. Then we move over to cocaine and then to marijuana. I know Kansas, obviously, we have not passed any sort of marijuana legalization or decriminalization. But just for reference, point to Missouri, which, our largest population centers are really close to the Missouri border, and marijuana is legal in Missouri. For weight references, you can legally possess 85 grams of marijuana. That's 3 ounces, essentially, of marijuana or THC in Missouri. I don't know if anyone besides me listens to sports radio in the morning on the way to work, but about every 4th commercial is for, buying marijuana at a Missouri dispensary. So if someone were to go over to the Missouri side, they could legally purchase 85 grams, which would be a severity level 3 felony, Kansas, based on weight alone. So just pointing that out. I hesitate to click on the Missouri trafficking statute, but I do have a link here to the Missouri trafficking statute. I'm not going to click on it because A, it's difficult to read, and B, I want to make sure that we can get back to where we're looking at. But for reference, the Missouri trafficking statute, it's 30 grams for heroin and 30 grams for methamphetamine. It's 10 grams for fentanyl. We jump back here, you can see how that compares. We get into distribution. I know it's labeled differently, and I want to point out I am not a licensed Missouri attorney, so please don't quiz me on Missouri statutes. But they're starting the trafficking number at 30 grams. We start it at less than 1 gram for meth and heroin and fentanyl. And I think everyone can agree that fentanyl is a very different world. Smaller amounts cause more damage, but we're essentially charging much differently than our neighbor to the east. So getting into looking at the sentences imposed, this is just for severity level 1 through 4. So any sort of distribution crime on the drug grid. The blue bar is prison. The orange box is probation. So they're at severity level 1. Last year, we had 26 severity level 1s ranging across different drug types. 10 of those cases were sentenced to probation. When we get into severity level 2, we are almost have twice as many severity level 2s getting probation as opposed to prison. Referencing back to the grid, regardless of your criminal history, you are presumptive prison for every single severity level 2. But in reality, almost twice as many people are getting probation as opposed to prison. Therefore, the guidelines are, I don't know, maybe they're not guiding people the same way. Same with severity level 3. We have 174 versus 133. And then it's severity level 3, 174 to 133, and then severity level 4 is 211 to 92. So I know what everyone's probably thinking. These are probably all low criminal history folks. That's why they got that. Well, here is the probation sentences across your criminal history. So as you can see in that first bar there, 7 people who pled guilty to severity level 2 drug distribution were criminal history A and received probation. Criminal history B, the number was 10 at severity level 2. For C, it was 12. And then as you can see, even for the severity level 1s, we had a criminal history E, criminal history F, and then we did have a lot of I's on the severity level 1. So that actually sort of makes sense as to what you're thinking. That being said, for severity level 2 and 3, It's really not criminal history contingent the way you might think it is. We are actually seeing a lot of criminal history A, criminal history B. So that's a history of 3+ person felonies, in addition to any non-person felonies and misdemeanors that you might have, and we're still seeing that number of probation sentences. This last slide is kind of difficult to see. It might be easier to actually see on your handout, but this adds the downward departures in addition to the durational departures. So you can actually see too, not only were there downward dispositional departures, but there were also downward durational departures. So even though they might still have received a prison sentence, we are seeing a lot of folks who are being sentenced to less than what the grid recommends. So this is just sort of a snapshot. As you can see, I have it grouped by criminal history and then severity level, and then across departures. We don't see a lot of upward departures really on the drug grid. And in fact, when we do see upward departures, that is a situation where typically someone has a lot of jail credit and they would prefer to just knock out the remainder of their sentence in prison as opposed to spend 1, 2, 3 years maybe on probation. So that I just am providing for a little bit of background. We can reference this again after Professor Osler and Director Mativi have their talk, but this is just to give us a little bit of frame of reference for the discussion as we go. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Osler.
All right. Thank you. And I found that fascinating. I'm going to be looking at those numbers a little bit after we get off. Just some background on who I am. I have been teaching criminal law and upper level criminal cases for 25 years, 10 years at Baylor. I got tenure there and then came up here to St. Thomas in Minnesota. But my background is as a prosecutor. Before I started teaching, I was a federal prosecutor in Detroit. So from 1995 to 2000, which was right in the heart of when we were doing a lot of crack cases. In addition to that, last year, about a year and a half ago, I took a leave of absence for a year here and went to work as the deputy county attorney in charge of the criminal division. So I oversaw all the drug prosecutions in Hennepin County, which is the largest county here in Minnesota that encompasses Minneapolis and the western suburbs. I am fundamentally a prosecutor. I'll front that. I'm not a believer in decriminalization, but I do think that there's things that we could do better to focus us and make us better at actually interdiction, doing better interdiction and making a difference. Several years ago, as I was studying crack sentencing in the federal system, I got a grant to have a economics professor from the university come over and teach me the economics of narcotics. And it really reframed the way I think about things. That, for one thing, through interdiction of any kind, the most that we can do because of the laws of supply and demand is to raise the price on the street. And also, when we raise the price on the street, that's probably going to be temporary so long as the demand continues for that narcotic. Just because of the laws of supply and demand, supply is always going to find demand. That said, my personal take on it is that even though the most we can do is to temporarily raise the price on the street, I think that's worth doing. And I say this, coming from a city where we've had tremendous problems with fentanyl. We saw over 1 overdose death per day in Hennepin County for a couple years there. So, very serious cost to narcotics use in the city where I live. But the thing is that if we do succeed in raising the cost on the street, that does reduce use. We know that even with highly addictive substances, there is a price sensitivity. And we know that from smoking, that's a highly addictive substance. When we raise the taxes, that smoking rates did go down. And we saw that what happened here is that the price of fentanyl on the street crashed. And we saw a corresponding rise in the rate of use that about 5 years ago, a single pill cost about $20 on the street. And that went down to about $2 on the street a year and a half ago. And that really mattered. And bringing the price back up has mattered too. Now, one of the things I think that sometimes takes us astray from what really works is this problem of using weight as a measure for culpability. Because if in the end what we want to do is disrupt narcotics networks and use the resources that we have to do something that is going to disrupt the market so that the price goes up, that we have to identify key people. That is, that we have to incapacitate and incarcerate the people who, if we pluck them out of that business model, are going to make a difference. That tends not to be the lower level people, the mules, the street sellers and people like that. I once gave a talk to a Republican club in Dallas, and this was after some things had developed with crack. And somebody there said something that really sunk into me, which is that you don't close down a business by sweeping up the low wage labor. And I asked him, and as a Republican club in Dallas, it was full of people, business people, how do you close down a business? And they said, well, you've got to take out cash flow and credit, or take out the key people that do things like logistics and know how the whole operation works. And so when I say that weight is a poor measure for culpability, what I mean is that it doesn't take us necessarily to the most important people. Just think all the way back to Al Capone. Al Capone, they took him down for taxes eventually. He didn't drive a beer truck. He did not, haul around liquor in the back of his car. He was apart from it, although he was the indispensable person who made the whole thing work. And we see that with drug networks as well. And when we use weight as the key metric or the only metric, one of the problems is that because of the way conspiracy laws work, we tend to even everybody out. So if I was to sitting here at my desk, hire someone to go down to Laredo and pick up 3 kilograms of methamphetamine and bring it back, and I'd sell it, and I pay that person $1,000, and I tell them who to meet and how to pick it up and how to drive it back and when to meet me when they get back with it. I stand to make a lot of money off that. Whereas the mule, he's just going to make the $500 to $1,000 for the trip. And if we take down the mule, that's not going to make much of a difference. But because if he's stopped and he's got the 3 kilos, he's going to be responsible for that. And if he flips on me, I'll be responsible for the same amount. But we're not equally culpable, and it won't make the same difference if you take us both out. One of the things I saw as a drug prosecutor was a lot of upside down cases where we ended up with a less culpable person, a less important person, doing a longer sentence than the person who was more important. And that's something that's problematic in a lot of ways. And one is it's just an inefficient way to raise the price on the street. We do know that what does correlate to culpability in any kind of market is the profit that someone takes from that market. The person who gets the most money is usually the one who has the most skills, who's positioned themselves to be a leader and organizer. So that said, that's kind of at 30,000 feet, but I don't want to stay at 30,000 feet. I want to talk about what I see when I look at your system. And a couple of things looking at your grid. Well, first of all, just on the, John's excellent presentation, it does seem that you have mass dispositional departures, especially at severity level 2. The other thing that I was surprised by is that, in that time period, there were only 26 severity level 1 cases coming through. Now, it could be that you just don't have that much drug trafficking at that level, in Kansas. But I suspect it's also a function of people pleading down, that they're pleading down to the lower levels if they're subject to a severity level 1. And a lot of those severity level 1s that you're seeing are probably people who went to trial. But when I look at your drug grid, I see a couple of things. One is that the very narrow range and pretty low for fentanyl, meth, and heroin. When you look at level 3, you've got this range of 1 gram to 3.5 grams, and above that for 3.5 to 100. Now, it kind of changes the way I think about it a little bit now that I see how much there's been dispositional departures on severity level 2, even with that large range going all the way up to 100 grams. The other thing is that while your top numbers at severity level 1 are they're higher than Minnesota's, they're a lot lower than the federal numbers. And I suspect that some of your most serious traffickers, like a lot of places, are being taken federal, perhaps for that reason. But if I could suggest something that I see looking at this, is that you might want to consider bumping up that border box. That would lead to fewer variances. And it's not necessarily signaling, oh, we're going easier on drug traffickers. It's just giving judges more discretion. I originally was thinking that it would make sense to bump the border box for E through I up to cover severity level 3. But given the amount of dispositional departures you've got on 2, you may think about kicking it up there too. The other thing that I thought as I looked at this is that it might make sense to create a severity level 0, and that is for the most serious traffickers. And as for the metric for that, key it to the level of profit that they take in a year, for example. And $100,000, $200,000. Now that does put something on prosecutors. They have to show that amount. But often on those larger level cases, we're already doing forfeitures. And if you're building a case against someone at that level, often you've got the financials on the person because you've got their ledgers and things like that. And so it would be possible to show. Now, you wouldn't have a lot of cases at that 0 severity level, but it would be a big deal. And you could key it to a much higher sentencing range. And that is something too that would hopefully focus law enforcement on the most important people. Not that they already are. I think that happens naturally. I believe law enforcement wants to make a difference and go after the most important people, but it would recognize that work in a different way and incapacitate those people who make the most difference. But anyways, that's what I see as I look at this. And I look forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mark. Tony? You're up.
Yes, sir.
I have
Yes.
just a quick question. Don't you think we should use Chat GPT to look at the factors that on all the diversions? In other words, at least for level 3 and 4. In other words, could we isolate out from the opinions and the orders, exactly what was it about those specific cases?
That would be a possibility. I don't know that, I think it would take some legwork on the front end to be able to determine what we're actually wanting to get out of it. But it's a possibility that we could do that. I would have to probably look at it a little bit more because of the considerations that we talked about earlier this morning, to make sure that part of the issues, and we didn't talk about it as much, but bias in the data that we actually place in there, how far back are we going to go?
Is it a year? Is it, things were much different back 30 years ago than they are today or 10 years ago.
Just go back 1 year. I mean,
So,
just to
and,
get
and
an
that,
idea.
that would be a possibility. But I think it would be incumbent to understand what exactly it was that we were trying to get at in looking at that.
Any commonality
Right,
that, there's some very obvious ones, I'm sure,
right.
but there may be some others that, and then the question becomes, is there something about our sentencing that might change or eliminate or highlight in some way those features that really are leading to the diversion that, even though the crime has been committed.
Well, I think what we see and what we've seen for many, many years is that the prosecutor, defense attorney, and the judge are essentially regulating this part of the system. You don't see that on the non-drug grid. You see that specifically on the drug grid, in which we see all these departures that are actually going on, whether that be dispositional or durational departures. And so that's been going on for many, many years. The issue, of course, becomes then we start doing modifications that, whether that be Professor Osler's suggestions or anything else, it becomes a prosecutor tool then as it is right now to actually resolve cases. It also, in some ways, as when Mark and I have talked previously, it's a criminal defense tool as well, because you're getting a good deal for your client by doing something of this nature too. So there's a push and pull that's going on that any change is going to actually cause that. And we can with the data that we have right now and with the crack research team that we do have, we can actually tell that currently and have for many, many years. Trying to see some trends or something potentially could be a use of that for ChatGPT. So hopefully that.
Anyway, yeah,
That kind of.
that whole thing's up, but I just,
Very
thank
good.
you.
Tony, welcome. We're excited to hear about your perspective on things, and as well as Mickey is joining us online. He wanted to be he's done undercover work, and for those reasons, confidentiality, wanted to stay such. So with that, Tony, please take it away.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. For those people listening in, I'm Tony Mativi. I'm the director of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. When Scott called, he told me you were looking primarily for information on drug quantities and at what level what is the KBI's perspective on the level at which those quantities shift from possession to a presumption of possession with intent to distribute or a presumption of distribution. So that's what I came prepared to address, although I will tell you the same thing I've told Scott, which is my perspective on that is not nearly as valid or I think as important for you to hear as the perspective of some of our folks who work on the streets. Because they're the people who see it every day. They're the people that are out there every day in contact with people that are using drugs, in contact with people that are selling drugs. And so it's their perspective, I think, that would make a difference to you in your discussions about where those levels fit as between dealers and users. I would, though, if you'll let me, offer a couple of perspectives on Professor Osler's testimony. Having spent a little bit of time prosecuting drug cases at the state level, and then having spent quite a bit of time prosecuting drug cases at the federal level, I think there are some important distinctions in Kansas between those two systems that you might want to consider in your deliberations today. Recognizing it's been a hot minute since I did that. So I don't know how much things have changed in the years that I have not been involved in that work. But one of the things Professor Osler mentioned is that weight is a poor measure of culpability. He's not wrong. But in my experience as a prosecutor, it's very hard to find another measure of culpability that's useful when it comes to holding someone accountable. So I think I would offer an amendment to that sentence, and that would be to say weight is a rough measure of culpability. Because if you don't use weight, it's very hard to come up with another measure, in my view. And I agree completely with Professor Osler's statement that conspiracy tends to even everyone out. And his example of directing someone to go make a purchase, I think, is a very good example. But that doesn't take into account how conspiracy is prosecuted and where it's prosecuted. So for example, I don't remember ever prosecuting a conspiracy case in state court when it came to drug trafficking. But in federal court, I think every drug trafficking case I prosecuted in federal court was a conspiracy case. And under the federal sentencing scheme, there are enhancements for organizers and leaders. There are enhancements for supervisors and managers, and there are reductions for minor participants. So although conspiracy does tend to even everyone out, most of those drug trafficking conspiracy cases are prosecuted in federal court, and that has a scheme built into the sentencing structure that I think sort of accounts for that evening out process. Typically, when you have a low-level person come in, they are sentenced for the amount of drugs attributable to the conspiracy, but then a minor participant or a minimal participant will seek a reduction below that amount. On the other hand, the prosecutors will generally ask for an enhancement for a manager or supervisor, and then an enhancement even above that for an organizer or leader. So in Professor Osler's scenario, the guy he sends to Laredo is probably going to be held accountable, at least in theory, for the amount of drugs trafficked. But Professor Osler would likely be held accountable as an organizer or leader at back in the day when I was doing these cases, that would have been a 4-level enhancement in the federal system if you were an organizer or leader, versus a 2-level reduction for a minor participant and 4-level reduction for a minimal participant. That is a sentencing scheme very different from what the state has. Right? So I'm not familiar with an enhancement or reduction scheme on the state drug guidelines that accounts for raising the sentence for an organizer or leader or reducing the sentence for a minimal participant other than the judge's ability to depart, whether it's a dispositional departure or a durational departure, either one. I've heard a little bit of discussion about the idea of holding mules appropriately accountable for their actions. That's an excellent example of where in the federal system, the scheme is important. It was to me, as a federal drug prosecutor, equally important to have a hammer over the head of the mule. To go back to Professor Osler's question to you, which was, how do you take down the top people in an organization? Well, one of the most effective ways that you take down the top people in the organization is you flip the lower people up above their bosses. You flip them, right? You get them to come in, plead guilty, and testify against the people they work for. If you look, and in the federal system, the mule receives, and there's an incentive to do that, both in the minimal participant or minor participant reduction they would get, but also in a favorable sentencing recommendation from the prosecutor, right? So that way, even you have to have the amount in order to have the ability to exert some influence over the mule to get the mule to cooperate. Because otherwise, it is very, very difficult to take down the top people in the organization. So those were just my observations based on Professor Osler's comments about having prosecuted cases. Now, when it comes to the amounts, Mickey Rance is what we call an assistant special agent in charge. That is a supervisory level position at KBI. Mickey was fairly recently promoted into that role. Before that, he did the bulk of our undercover work at the KBI. He operated undercover every day. When I started at KBI almost 3 years ago, Mickey was operating, making purchases at the cartel level without embellishing, these are hundreds of thousands of fentanyl pills at a time. that Mickey was out on the street buying. Although he is now supervisor, he supervises our JFIT, our Joint Fentanyl Impact Team. They are literally the tip of the spear for us. JFIT is out there making undercover purchases every single day across the state of Kansas. Mickey supervises that team. He also supervises our undercover task force. But in addition to that, we do still use him occasionally for undercover work. And it's not the fact, as Scott pointed out, that he's done undercover work in the past that caused us to want to shield his identity. It's the fact that he continues to do undercover work and will continue a little bit of undercover work. And that's why we didn't want him on a camera. But I think, so Mickey is prepared to address for you those specific quantity levels. And so with your permission, I'll just turn it over to Mickey. And I know he's got a bit of a presentation. And then I think the main thing is he's ready for your questions, your drug specific questions. Mickey, go ahead.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. So appreciate the kind words from the director. To give you a little more insight about my career, I've spent 27 years in law enforcement in Kansas, and 25 of it has been working narcotics. I've worked at your local task force level, your county task force level, your state level, and I've literally done undercover for every federal agency except the CIA. I've been in and out of Mexico on undercover stuff. So I come with an insight, and I was appreciative that the professor really kind of got into the economics of it, because economics is what drives it, not only at the top level, but all the way down to the street level. So fortunately, we're starting to see some trends change that we were very much hoping for across the country. We are seeing in our numbers and in national numbers the decline in our fentanyl use. To understand why the fentanyl stuff got so out of control for us is that in the history of drug distribution, there had never been a drug that generated the profit revenues for the cartels that fentanyl did. So as we were dealing with that, to kind of put the economic side of that into play, I could, at the time when I was dealing directly with Mexico, I could buy a kilo of fentanyl powder for about $14,000. The national average at the time was between 14 and 18% pure. The rest was cutting agent. I could then take that exact same kilo, press that into pills, and make about 75,000 pills. So for a $14,000, $14,000 to $18,000 investment, I could make $200,000. Since the change in stuff that we're doing at the national level, and basically going after them as terrorist organizations, I have constant conversations with cartel members who are saying, hey, we are making a change. We are making a change. CJNG actually has their own Facebook page. For those who aren't familiar, that's going to be the next problem as Sinaloa cartel kind of falls apart. New Generation Cartel has said, yeah, we've already started our pivot, and we're pivoting out of fentanyl and into cocaine. And sure enough, as I travel around the state and I deal with your local drug task forces and with the federal task forces, cocaine is everywhere right now. And so that becomes a concern, because for those of you who lived through the crack cocaine days, I know not far behind when we start having the explosion of cocaine, we're going to be pivoting back to the days of selling crack, cheap, inexpensive highs. So the good thing is fentanyl and heroin use is on the decline. The bad side is methamphetamine and cocaine are on the increase. Methamphetamine, not nearly as much, because the profit margins still aren't there. We can buy kilos of cocaine in Kansas for between $3,000 and $4,000. If I'm buying it directly from Mexican DTOs that I'm coordinating out of Mexico with, I can get that for under $3,000. And here's the economics on how it comes down to your personal use members of your community. Where we used to say a good rule of thumb was $100 a gram. That's nowhere close anymore. So now we can see those 8 balls of methamphetamine that are sold over and over again for less than $100. So we're at 3.5 grams right there. If I am moving into multi-ounce where we're doing 1 or 2 ounces, so at the 1 ounce, we're at the 28 grams. I'm actually headed to buy some today. I'm buying 3 ounces and we're paying $250 an ounce for it. So the economics of how the guys at the higher level make their money is our local dealers and our mid-level dealers as they parcel that out. And as I was looking through our sentencing numbers for our level 1 and level 2s, I think the director is correct in saying that I can specifically talk for our state groups. When we get into targeting our main dealers, and I agree, the economics, if you want to change a culture, you have to target your drug trafficking organizations in your community. And as we do that, typically where we end up doing that is in federal court because of jurisdictional issues where I might start a case in Topeka, Kansas, that then goes to Wichita, that then goes to Phoenix, that then goes into Mexico. So those cases where we have those very large amounts of drugs and those large 10, 20, 30 person conspiracies, those are best suited for our federal courts. Where you at the local level where we're seeing this is our DTOs getting to those low and mid-level dealers. Used to, if we had a guy in a community that had a pound of dope, we'd say that is a big dealer. I would say that definitely changed in the last 5 years. Now we see low-level dealers that can literally roll a pound of meth every other day in your community. And part of that is because there was such oversaturation of the market from our DTOs. Now, has that started changing with the lockdown, more scrutiny at the border? Absolutely. But for anybody who's visited the border and watched the flow of traffic coming in and out, it doesn't take too many semis to get through or too many commercial vehicles to get through to completely saturate a community or a state with high quality controlled substances, whether it be cocaine, fentanyl, or methamphetamine. So what we're seeing with our fentanyl use, it really depends on where you're at on the abuse scale. I still know people that will use small amounts of fentanyl. Unfortunately, I have dealt with some kids who have now spent 5 or 6 years using fentanyl, and their fentanyl use may be 25 or 30 pills a day. And where we kind of get into the science of that is knowing that, first of all, the national average on our fentanyl pills is about 2.2 milligrams of fentanyl per pill. The problem is that's made in a bucket. So that you may get 2.2 milligrams, you may get 7 milligrams. And now that we've the users have kind of got away from orally ingesting them and now cutting them down and what they call hot railing, which is basically chopping up with a razor blade, putting it on a piece of foil and smoking it so you get a quicker high. That's where we're seeing that overdose stuff come from. My guy that was the heaviest user I've met had actually started in Turner High School in 7th grade. And at the time that we arrested him in Missouri, he said, I'm 25, 30 pills a day. He goes, but I'm still orally taking them so that I can force myself to throw up before I black out. So hopefully with the decline on fentanyl, we're getting away from that. But what I do anticipate that we're going to see is the increase of going back to heroin, which we just bought last week, China white heroin, which I probably hadn't seen in 8 or 9 years, was now back in an area. We've started seeing the pickup of crack coming back. We've seen it on 2 different cases now in the Northeast where we hadn't seen crack since meth prices really got low. But I think we're going to quickly see the changes in our community as the business models in Mexico change. The other concern that we spend time battling with right now is how to handle the overdoses associated with our high schoolers buying what they perceive as legal hemp at these convenience store and head shops, and being able to buy products that are being sold under the umbrella of hemp until they're lit and the THC acid. What we do know from our testing and a federal case that I'm undercover with now is almost none of that product is actually hemp. It's all marijuana. Now, yes, they may be adding to it, but even our big commercial businesses know it's actually cheaper. We should just buy the marijuana and not add THC acid to it. The problem we're seeing is the marijuana of 20 years ago that might be 2 to 4% THC is now readily marketable as THCA or THC acid on hemp that's anywhere from 25 to 35% THC once a heating source is added to it. And I have a feeling for those who lived through the crack epidemic, then the meth lab epidemic, then the fentanyl epidemic, now we're going to battle going back to revisionist history with crack and the problems associated with the marijuana and hemp industry. But I'm happy to discuss anything that you are seeing or have any questions about as far as use and distribution within certain regions. The interesting thing about the state of Kansas is it's incredibly diverse depending on where you're at. What may not be a federal case in one area of the state may be a federal case in another part of the state. And when we have 2 large cities, being Wichita and Kansas City, that are considered national hubs for drug distribution, that has to go somewhere. That pushes to those small communities. And with the amount of police presence in those large communities, we saw it not too recently or not too long ago on a federal case that we did where it was a huge transnational group operating out of a small community because they knew the drug task force had 2 people. And sure enough, this was stuff that was literally hundreds and hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine coming in liquid form through commercial vehicles out of Mexico to this small community to be pushed to metropolitan hubs, not just in Kansas, but across the country. So there is no doubt, if you ever have any question of whether or not the cartel is active in your state, there should be no doubt that the cartel touches almost every community in the state of Kansas.
Hey, Mickey, address if you would, you went over the sentencing guidelines and the quantities for each drug.
Yes.
And you told me your thoughts on those. Would you share them with the commission as well, please?
Yes. So the one that really stood out to me has to do with our cocaine. So right now on a level 1 cocaine, we're at over a kilo. All right. So you can have, so we're 1,000 grams to be a level 1. The problem is with most of your local drug agencies, even if you have a cocaine problem, it's going to be cost prohibitive for them to even be able to work that case, because if they're going to try to get in there and get you best evidence as a prosecutor for the court and put that 1 kilo on a drug dealer, they're going to have to somehow come up with $20,000. And I'm using that as kind of a mid-level. We see it anywhere from right now from $15,000 a kilo to $25,000 a kilo, depending on how far away you are from the metro. What I'd like to see is if we made an adjustment on the cocaine and brought it down more in line with our federal guidelines, where the federal guideline is at 500 grams. And then I don't, I can even make the argument. I mean, if we're at 500 grams, even for most of those cases, they're going to have to call in JFIT or a federal agency. And so that's the one advantage I have with the current drug task force that we have for the state. We have all the federal agencies under me with DEA, ATF, Postal, HSI, and then we also have the state agency of Kansas Highway Patrol working with us. And then we are in the process of bringing 16 local agencies on. Because what we found is if we truly want to make an impact in your community, we have to have the manpower and financial resources to do that. So that's kind of the idea behind that model. But I think if we adjusted the cocaine down to 500 grams at the level 1, and then go from 50 to 500 at a level 2, and then 3.5 to 50 on level 3, I think that's going to help get us in front of the problem that we know is coming.
Mickey, what about the user amounts versus dealer amounts? Where are they in relation to what you're seeing on the street?
So I'll be honest with you on these user amounts. We don't see those because of what we're specifically targeting a lot. A lot of times if we're seeing those user amounts, and as we're analyzing the cases, yes, they are definitely out there. But when I start looking at how this person, if you have a user or you have somebody that's in a conspiracy, how are they going to go through the case? A lot of times it is just not conducive for us to use somebody that's at that user level. Yes, they're consistently buying 8 balls for 60 to 80 bucks of meth. They might be buying a teener for 1.75 grams for 20 or 30 bucks. But where we're trying to focus our energy is, all right, who is our ounce level dealer and who is that ounce level dealer ultimately supplied by? I can usually tell pretty quick as agencies present cases to me how far they are removed from their Mexican sources of supply just based on the amount that they're being charged. I'll usually be within a level or so of how close we are to the source. And so as the professor was talking about, how do we charge those conspiracies out with our lower people? The problem is, as we do the conspiracy, ultimately, we need storytellers. And it literally, for me, having been in undercover cases for multiple years across the country, you don't all of a sudden, we might be able to identify who your main dealer is in your region. That does not mean that without a long investigation, we can necessarily get close to them because they have insulated themselves where they're giving instruction and not necessarily getting their hands on any kind of product. And a lot of times, not even the money. A lot of times the money movement is simply from their dealers to a mid-level management who is then paying for a product that's in Mexico, and your true drug kingpins in your area are simply given instructions.
So I wonder if at this point it would be most productive just to open it up for questions, regardless of to whom.
I think it'd be good.
Judge Donovan.
Do you see the distributors of jugs also being users?
So what we'll typically see with our methamphetamine users is our low and mid-level dealers will almost always be users because it's such a social drug for them that they will almost always be users and basically selling enough drugs to support their habit and make some money. At the high level, it is a huge no-no to be using any of your product. In the 9 years that I've spent with the cartel, and the hundreds of undercovers that I've done with them, I can literally count on one hand how many times I've either seen paraphernalia in their house that was for use or been offered drugs just as a recreational use. Because their business model is such that once you become a user or addict, you make poor decisions. And that is bad for the business model.
Yeah, and I just add that we see the same thing here in Minneapolis, and having gotten to see interviews and things, it's kind of striking, the dichotomy between the lower level people who are addicted often and the people who are up, who frankly often have contempt for the users of their product, and would definitely stay away from it.
Yeah, and really what drives your crime at the local level, whether it be persons crimes or property crimes, is really at that the user level or low level drug dealer who now I've used more product that I had fronted to me that I now owe on. So that drives a lot of the crime, or your user who is doing your auto burglaries or your shop or your retail thefts and then trading those to their drug dealers. What we see at the higher levels is that is very much a business transaction. There is a lot of high level meetings. There are a lot of conference calls. There is a lot of discussion about best way to do stuff, and using the product is just never looked at in a positive manner.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Absolutely.
Okay, so my follow-up to that is the Sentencing Commission is tasked with keeping our eye on prison bed space. And we also have this information that judges across our great state are departing to lower sentences, either putting people on probation or putting people in prison for a less amount of time. And so my question is, do these numbers need to be raised so that they are more accurate? Because if you're putting someone in prison, let's say with no record because they have less than a gram of meth, for over a year, is that logical? Because is that person, or let me go to a level 3, 1 gram to 3.5 grams. Is that person actually selling, or is that a user? I mean, because I think the officers on the street who are arresting these people who are high out of their minds in their cars, or they, basically keep breaking into houses to steal things to sell,
and I think
be their use. What are those numbers?
And so what I think you have to look at for me is the totality of what that case was. If I just catch somebody with an 8 ball or a gram and we didn't order that up, for me, that tends to believe that they're going to be a user, especially if there's a pipe or paraphernalia associated with it. What we do is we do a ton of controlled buys. So it may not be uncommon if we order an 8 ball and they get stopped, that might be the only thing they have on them, or the 3.5 grams. I think where the frustration lies is if drug units who are really trying to clean up the community, I get called a lot of, hey, can you look at this and tell us how to make this into a federal case? Because they might already have a level 1 or level 2 in their community. But their fear is, even looking at the sentencing guideline, they know there's going to be a downward departure and they're not going to have solved the issue. And so that's where we end up. Now, a lot of times we will come in, there are cases that we have adopted for federal prosecution. There are other cases that then we take those cases and then build those into federal conspiracies. And the director is correct in when he says that most of our conspiracies have to go federal because we get into such a jurisdictional issue of the transient nature of narcotics. And that's why we don't see many of the conspiracy charges actually laid out in communities.
So I'm just going to guess that the departures are almost entirely, at least a very high percentage, done by plea agreement. That these are. Go ahead.
I would agree.
So so when we talk, I want to make sure that, because it's almost like the prosecutors and defense attorneys are getting together and skewing the system to where they should believe it should be.
Judge, I'm gonna take offense to skewing this.
Well, no, you know, I apologize. Poor choice of words, Jessica. I apologize.
Those people know,
Yeah. can I
the
ask a question
prosecutor and the
based on that?
defense attorney know what the case is about, and you know whether this, I think they have a much better way of telling from the intelligence they have of whether this person is actually a user or they are actually a distributor, and so.
I'm gonna come to
that's-
Jessica. I have one other question. In the 90s and the 2000s, I'm old enough to know that there was a tremendous amount of active federal prosecution. If you had a level 1 drug dealer, it was going feds, and it put the fear of God into the defendant, and they were taken up. I hardly see that now. A number of level 1, level 2, they rarely go federal. Why is that? Is there, are the feds not interested anymore? Is there a thought that they're better prosecuted than the state level? Because I'm just simply not seeing those matters taken federal anymore.
Do you like
Who
to
is your
handle that,
question
Director, or
addressed
you
to,
would
Judge?
like me to?
Director.
Yeah, I'm not gonna answer that on the record.
Gotcha. Jessica.
So
I'm
I
not
know-
answering it.
I know, at least from my
Well-
perspective, there currently our sentencing guidelines, if they're followed, actually give us better time at the state than they would give us at the federal level. The problem is with the conspiracy stuff. So almost all our cases going federal are conspiracies. The other side of the federal system is, I would say, they are really bogged down in red tape, internal red tape that has been created over the years that has caused them to become way less effective than they were in the early 2000s.
I can remember practicing law, and if you had representing that person that was charged with those large, you tried to get into that state prosecutor and beg him to work a deal because you did not want it going federal because there was such a stigma and fear of federal prosecution.
Judge, I didn't mean to be flippant with you.
No, I get it.
I apologize for that, but I've spoken with the new U.S. attorney. He assures me he recognizes that that's become the perception of the office, and he is pretty vehement to me in his conviction that that's going to change. And so I hope we see. I agree with you. I mean, in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was very aggressive. And then for many years that it wasn't. And I hope our new U.S. attorney is going to sort of take us back to the future, if you will, and return to some of those aggressive drug prosecutions. But to talk
speak to that nationally a little bit, just that, one of the things that happened right at that time, at the end of the 90s, was 9/11. And there was a real shift of resources to anti-terrorism. You used to have an FBI narcotics unit in a lot of districts, for example, that those people got transferred to anti-terrorism. And I'm not sure the focus on the federal side, outside of the DEA, ever got back to narcotics in that way. The other thing is that, at least where I practiced, a lot of the street level cases were made by ATF back in the day too, and you saw ATF turning away from doing those cases.
Jessica.
I'm sorry, I was doing my own research here. My question, Mickey, if you don't mind, can you talk a little bit about and I know you touched on it, you spoke directly to the amounts on our cocaine, but for our fentanyl amounts, and I know this was a recent change, so it's hard, and I know Director was involved in this, it's hard to see if we're at the right point. I think when we recommended some levels on the fentanyl use, we tried to use some information from law enforcement to make sure it's at the right level. But I do have a question about those level 2s from the 3.5 grams to the 100 grams and whether that is the right range for our level 2s. I know we're probably leading some cases down to those or using those levels to utilize and find justice in those cases. But Mickey, what are you seeing in that 3.5 to 100 gram range? And is that something we also need to take a look at from your boots on the ground perspective? He does not
He's
want
not
to
on.
answer that question.
Hey, Mickey, you still there?
Yes, yes,
Did you hear Jessica's question?
yes, on the level 2 on the fentanyl, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so initially what we saw was we saw bulk amount of pills. What like our guys typically would start off on what was called a rack or a K-pack. So there were so many fentanyl pills out that we were buying 1,000 just to start off with. Now we've seen the switch to where we can't hardly find pills, and what we do see is powder. And the powder, because of the potency of it, without it being added to acetaminophen, is we're seeing those 3 and 8 balls or a 7 or a half ounce that is sold in powder form. But getting into the over 100 grams, quite frankly, it will be cost prohibitive for most of us to do. Just because the cost of fentanyl powder is so much higher. But yes, we are definitely seeing at the level 2 guys who we're ordering up, and they are definitely coming at that 8-ball range. And I see that 8-ball range of fentanyl so drastically different than the 8-ball with meth, which is now costing us less than $100 because it takes so little fentanyl to kill somebody. I mean, we've seen the overdoses where you have a 7 milligram or 0.007 grams of fentanyl, and somebody overdoses and dies. And
So that was
so,
my, sorry, that was my
Yes.
follow-up to John that I was looking at is, we don't have the data right now to tell us if those level 2s are the meth or the fentanyl, and we don't have the data.
No,
We can do that.
we know the drug. We don't
Don't know
know
the
the
amount.
amount.
So we're
Correct.
not tracking that amount when we do those dispositions, when we do those cases. So we can look at that disposition number, but we might not be able to give them the reality of what it actually is until we start tracking the amounts, which, as I offhandedly told John, we may skew anyways to get the resolution that we need on these levels. But I guess if I can ask a follow-up question to the director, from a policy standpoint, if you're prepared to provide this to me, and I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, does it make sense anymore to put fentanyl in the same category as meth and heroin?
Yeah, see, I mean, I was wondering the same thing as I stood here, right? In fentanyl, we look at dosage units. How many pills? If somebody has, Mickey, how many pills do you need to find on a person to presume they're a dealer rather than a user? When you've got people that are using 40 pills a day.
So what I use as a rule of thumb, and I agree with Jessica that fentanyl and heroin need to be moved into their own category, because we see the mixture. If I've got weak China white heroin, the easiest way to increase that is to add a little fentanyl to it, to add that synthetic opioid to the opioid already. So my argument would be, yes, separate out the meth from our fentanyl and heroin. And
My
for
follow-up
the-
question,
Okay.
Mickey, is if you have a gram of fentanyl powder on somebody, what does that tell you about their status in the system? In the distribution system?
So that typically will tell me they're a user. And
A gram of powder?
Yes, with a gram of fentanyl powder, unless we've specifically ordered it from them, that's most likely something they're going to smoke off foil.
Jessica, continue.
So I'm looking at this and I think the reason we see very, very different dispositions and lots of departures is because weights don't accurately measure somebody's status in this system. Somebody could have an 8-ball that's a level 2 or a level 3, and that could be a user or that could be a dealer. And all we are measuring is weights. And we also aren't looking at purity. So for things like fentanyl, how pure that is or how much is contained in it is a different story also. And I wonder if the problem isn't even the amounts. Like, I think our amounts are way off because we have users buying things that fall as a level 2 or a level 3 on this grid because they are using regularly. But, perhaps
instead of, I mean, we should reassess these amounts, but perhaps there should be more to the analysis. Like, do we have evidence of dealership from some other thing? Are there text messages? Are there, pill presses? Are there things that indicate this is somebody that's using or dealing? And also, like, I'm just wondering if we should build in some of those other things to our grid, not just weights, because weights are too variable where somebody's at in the system.
Just for the sake of argument, instead of changing the weights, if you're gonna build something into the system, why not build in a set of enhancements and reductions based on status within the system like the feds do?
There's just so many things that aren't currently measured by what we're actually doing.
I kind of go back to weight being a rough method, but what other measure do you have as a starting point?
Sir, question?
Right, so some of what I was thinking and gonna ask about, you've raised, and that was, why are we treating fentanyl and meth the same? I'm sorry, and heroin the same as meth, so I agree on that. I may have missed it, but why is it that we believe that fentanyl distribution is down and meth is up?
We believe it because of, I believe it primarily because what Mickey is seeing on the street. When 2.5 years ago, when we set up JFIT, Mickey was able to buy 100,000, 200,000 fentanyl pills at a time. Right now, he can't find 2,000 fentanyl pills available out there on the street.
Right, but my question is, why is that happening? If we can speculate on that.
Mickey, you and I have talked about this. Go ahead.
Well, you addressed us, I think, 3 years ago.
Would have been two.
2 years ago, and you talked at that time about the cost of a pill, and at that time being about $25, but that we were about 6 months behind the border. And at the border, that same pill was costing much less.
So we've seen the price of fentanyl pills plummet. They've gone down dramatically, but at the same time, the availability has almost evaporated. And to me, I wish I could say that what we're doing in Kansas made a difference in the availability of meth or of fentanyl. I believe that it has. I don't have any way to quantify that for you. I think what's happened is a difference in what's going on in the border and the way the border has been shut off and the way the current administration has pressured the Mexican government to get the cartels to curtail fentanyl production. So what we are hearing is that one of the two major Mexican drug cartels has completely stopped production of fentanyl, and the other one has dramatically decreased it because of pressure from the Mexican government, which has resulted from pressure from the American government to get the Mexican government to actually clamp down on the cartels instead of what they've been doing for years, which was telling us they were clamping down on the cartels, but not actually doing it. So now that the Mexican government is actually clamping down on the cartels, I think that's what is responsible for the reduction in the amount of fentanyl that's being trafficked into the United States. But what these folks are seeing on the street, the cartel isn't going to let their revenue supply be a net decrease. So if they're importing less fentanyl, in my view, that's what's responsible for the increase in the importation of meth and especially the increase in the importation of cocaine, because they've got to make up that revenue flow somewhere. Now, cocaine and meth don't kill people the way that fentanyl does. So we are seeing fewer overdoses. We're seeing fewer fentanyl overdose deaths, primarily as a result of the decreased amount of fentanyl that's out there. But they're more than making up for it in the amount of meth and especially in the amount of cocaine, which we hadn't been seeing at all. And now we're seeing tremendous amounts of it.
The Wall Street Journal yesterday had as one of its headlines, nationwide, cocaine is up, fentanyl is way down, that it's being seen across the United States.
Go ahead.
So just to follow up, you gave two reasons. One was the border, and the second was the pressure that the administration is putting on the government. The second one seems right to me. The first one doesn't, because if it's border closings, that would seem to affect the meth and the cocaine importation as well as the fentanyl.
Yeah, I agree that it would seem that way. I can tell you that having been to the border, the difference between a year ago and today is just, it's dramatic.
Yeah, I don't.
So I think the pipeline the spigot has been shut way down.
Yeah.
And they're still getting some stuff through. And what they're pushing through the spigot now is far less fentanyl, more cocaine and more methamphetamine. We had a seizure of a meth lab conversion, liquid meth being brought across the border into the United States, into Kansas. And we had a conversion lab seized in Lyon County just a couple of months ago. They're figuring out different ways to bring it across the border and then they're bringing it across as a liquid and then drying it back out and selling it. And that was a case that Mickey was responsible for.
Dr. John Groovy has a question.
It's not a question, but I think it adds to the discussion kind of a little bit to Jessica Glendenning's point a little bit. I ran the numbers and when we are looking at those severity level 2s and 3s, the sentences for prison specifically are kind of not equally distributed across the state. What we're actually kind of seeing is a lot of small rural jurisdictions, prison all the time. Bigger jurisdictions where we're seeing that probation. I think that's something that could probably be a little bit across all crimes, but that specifically when we're thinking about it and thinking about guidance and how we might want to change that, we're not really seeing sort of an equal justice across counties. If you are caught with a level 2 amount in one county, it's prison. In another county, I can point out all 11 went probation. So in one county, all the 2s were probation, and another county, 1 over, they all went to prison. I know there's individual case level factors that could be a play there, but it's probably more, they're just not dealing with it as much. So they're sending those level 2s to prison. Just something to consider when we're thinking about this is there's some major county variances.
No, we're over time. Carl, go right ahead, please.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think, fentanyl was being brought in from China and then be processed in Mexico. I think Scheinbaum is much stronger than Obrador is and has actually done something about the crime in drug production, whereas cocaine is simply shipped. So I think it's the fact that Mexico is not as willing to reproduce fentanyl out of the shipments from China.
Mr. Wilson.
And are you seeing an increase with fentanyl being cut with heroin and methamphetamine as well, cocaine? Is that what added to the cash of fentanyl?
I don't think we're seeing fentanyl being cut with heroin because they're both opioid. And heroin's more expensive to get than fentanyl is. We've for years now have seen fentanyl introduced with mixed into methamphetamine.
Are you seeing an increase in that?
I don't know, Mickey, I'll defer to you on this. Are we seeing fentanyl mixed with meth more today or less today than we have in the past?
Fentanyl being mixed with everything. With cocaine, with methamphetamine, the users would refer to it as sleepy dope because you could still get that methamphetamine high and then still sleep at night. So we saw that. What we saw, and it goes back to the business model. If you know you can make $200,000 off that kilo, what you want to do is make everyone a fentanyl addict. The deaths they don't want. They need the customers. What they were trying to do at the time with the fentanyl and putting it into everything was to transition people over from cocaine and meth and get them hooked on fentanyl, knowing that if they didn't keep using it, they would get ill because that's where the profits were at.
Director Schultz.
I've got a couple questions. The first is, we've kind of talked top down here in terms of distribution. I'm wanting to know, and Mickey, you may not know this, and maybe you have somebody to recommend us to, but talk about possession limits. We've talked about, the 25, 30 pills per day. We've talked about up to a gram, presuming they're a user. Where can we actually go in this in terms of, because I can see it, I almost would call it the Sam's Club warehouse type of situation. If the drug is cheap, I may be buying in bulk for personal use. So how do we potentially then look at that for personal use versus the distribution?
Well, for us on the investigator side, we're looking at the totality of what it was. Because, I mean, it kind of goes back to if you think about the one pill can kill. If I distribute one pill of fentanyl to my friend and then he overdoses and dies, we charge him both state and federal with the distribution, even though it was only one pill and resulting in a drug overdose death. So for us, it is if I'm a user and I'm a heavy user, let's say I'm smoking an 8-ball of meth a day. If I'm that heavy user, there's always going to be paraphernalia with it, personal use paraphernalia, pipes, foil, syringes, stuff like that. If I'm a dealer and I'm dealing 8 balls, the first thing that those guys are always going to question from the user is, hey, does this weigh out right? So they're going to have scales. They're going to have the text messages from the cell phone downloads that we do that basically correspond with that 8-ball dealer saying, hey, yeah, I can sell you an 8-ball, or I can sell you a basketball or a ball. We're going to see that. And even though it may be a smaller amount, it's still a distribution when we look at it.
But we're not taking into account, the guidelines doesn't take into account those factors. It's proof, it's more proof certainly of distribution, but we're basically based solely on weight. So that basically means no matter what you're possessing, as long as it meets that threshold, yes, it's going to be easier to prove, certainly. I totally get that. So I think that's the struggle, and maybe that's what Jessica was talking about too, is maybe we need to look at other factors, because otherwise, as a prosecutor, I can still charge that because it meets that threshold. So we're into severity level 1 through 4.
And I would argue, Scott, that at least your weight gives you a starting point.
Right.
Right? If you've got distribution paraphernalia, your weight gives you an idea of how much that person's distributing. If you've got a certain weight and you don't have any distribution paraphernalia, all you have is user paraphernalia, to me, that's a different scenario, right? But at least your weight gives you a starting point.
Well, and I guess that's my second question then. I'm a barbecue guy. And so I buy briskets and things like that. If I go to my local meat shop and I want to buy a nice meaty brisket, and he comes out, and I'm buying, of course, as we know, we buy meat by the pound. So I come in and he comes out with this metal box with the brisket and he puts it on the scale. Well, it's obviously going to weigh more than what the brisket actually is. There's been talks multiple years as far as having KBI potentially having the capabilities of actually the lab being able to measure purity. And I don't know whether it's purity or potency, but the ability to actually do that. The talks at the time, of course, it wasn't financially feasible because it was going to cost several $100,000 to get whatever the machines were that were there. Is that something that would still be possible so that when drugs are sent to the KBI lab, you could actually measure that based upon, because now with the advent of edibles and everything else, liquids as well that contain controlled substances, how does that skew charging and everything else unless you know how much of that substance is in whatever product that is?
So quantitative analysis is something that we do with a lot of drugs, but we don't do with all drugs. And to do a quant on marijuana is very different than to do a quant on cocaine or on methamphetamine. And we are set up to do quants on cocaine, methamphetamine. I think I'm right about both of those. We aren't even close to being set up to doing quants on marijuana. And then you add in things like edibles, putting that into a mass spectrometer is very different than putting a powder into a mass spectrometer. And one of the things that we don't know is how much, I'm trying to figure out a way to say this without stumbling over the words, how much less longer the mass spectrometer's lifespan is if we're feeding in gummy materials like edibles versus just powder, right? We don't know what that does to the lifespan of a mass spec, but we know it's going to reduce the lifespan of the mass spec. And we're already not on a frequent enough replacement cycle for those mass specs just because of budget issues.
But don't you think that the fact that you have, if you have a system that is based on weight, this becomes problematic, does it not? Because I'm now having to, if I have a pan of brownies, am I getting charged with that particular weight? Or am I getting charged with what substance may be in that?
We're using so many metaphors now, I'm having a hard time keeping my.
I'm getting hungry.
They're all food.
lunchtime.
It's all food, right?
So instead of a brownie brisket, let me just talk to you about a bag of fentanyl, right? There's a big difference in that bag of fentanyl, whether it's an 18% pure bag or 100% pure bag, right? The 18% pure bag has been stepped on many, many times. The person who has that bag is way lower down the distribution scale, and they're going to be able to make far less money off of what's in that bag than if it is the same size bag with 100% pure fentanyl. But we can quant those. I'm pretty sure that we can quant that.
Okay.
Well, fascinating discussion. Professor Osler, Director Mativi, Mickey, and Dr. John Gerby, thank you very much. It's always wonderful to have you here. Let's adjourn for lunch and we'll start back up 5 after.
Yep. that
5
sounds
after
good.
5 after 1. All right.
Don't forget to get the drink if you want something more than water. Again,